Religious leaders can now endorse political candidates without risking their organization's tax-exempt status. The IRS
The mission of this task force will be to immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government.
One of the striking trends in American religion and politics over the past decade has been the extent to which Christians have rallied around President Donald Trump. Now, this alignment has been especially pronounced among white evangelicals, but Trump has also gained ground among most Christian denominations across multiple racial groups since 2016, with black evangelicals being the notable exception. By contrast, Jews, other non-Christians, and those with no religious affiliation were solidly behind former Vice President Kamala Harris in 2024. But Trump hasn't just appealed to Christian voters through rhetoric. He's also courted them through policy. Some recent examples. In February, he launched a task force to root out anti-Christian bias in the federal government, and following an IRS filing earlier this month, churches can now endorse political candidates from the pulpit. But Christians in America are not a monolith. There's wide disagreement among Christians over President Trump's agenda, and even more variation in how his administration's policy affect different communities of faith. To help us unpack the religious politics of Trump's second term, we have Michael Emerson back on the podcast. He's the Siobhan Fellow in Religion and Public Policy at the Baker Institute, as well as the director of our Religion and Public Policy program. He's a sociologist whose work focuses on how religion and policy shape each other, both in the United States and abroad. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Michael, thank you for joining me today. I'd like to start by a little bit about your background, both as an academic, a scholar engaged in the politics of Christianity and religion more broadly.
Yeah, great to be here. And I thank you. You know, for the last 3 decades, I've been studying religion, race, immigration, politics, and it's become more and more interesting, I would say. And religion has really risen in importance. And so I've become ever more interested, and I think we have more and more folks that are interested in it as well.
So after the 2024 election, you published an article in The Conversation that explores trends in the social and political views of Christians. Among people who identify as Christians, where is the support for President Trump most concentrated? What issues matter the most to these groups?
What's so interesting, what we try to outline in that piece is that over time, a new category has emerged that matters. So we know that white evangelicals, conservative Christians have voted conservatively, have voted for Republicans since the 80s, since Ronald Reagan. But over time, and especially since Donald Trump has been running, we see that we have the majority of all practicing Christian groups, except for African Americans. So when I say practicing Christian, I mean that they actually are attending places of worship. And when they do, we find that whether they're white Protestant, white Catholic, Hispanic, Asian, across these groups, they are supporting Republicans more and more, and specifically Donald Trump. Now, you had asked, what is it that they care about? What issues matter? The issues that seem to come up over and over, some would seem clearly religious, like moral issues, abortion. A big one of late has been gender ideology. What is a man? What is a woman? But then there are issues that seem less directly connected. So issues like immigration are huge among these supporters, Christian supporters, religious supporters of Donald Trump. Issues like the importance of being somebody who works and is productive by their definition. Now, why does this matter? So traditionally, when we think about cleavages and who votes for whom, there's kind of 2 lines if you think about cross-cutting lines. One is the economic cleavage, right? So on one end, you would have people that support the free market. That would tend to be Republican. And on the other end, some state interventions, Democrat. And then if you look at the vertical line, it would be this focus on religious or moral cleavage. So you would be socially, religiously conservative or religiously liberal. But something's happened since 2000, and particularly since Trump has taken office. But it hasn't just happened in the US, and you and I have talked about this. It's happening around the world, and it's what we would call ethno-religious nationalism. There's a new cleavage that's cross-cutting these other two and making it confusing for understanding who votes for whom. And it's what I would call the identity cleavage. And the two ends of that identity cleavage are those who are globalists or cosmopolitanists or anywheres. It's a funny term, but meaning people everywhere, anywhere, versus nationalists, nativists, localists, somewheres. And what we're seeing across the US and across the world is a rise of nationalism, this identity of what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a Hungarian? What does it mean to be a German? And so on.
So, Michael, let's talk a little bit more about that as it ties into the focus upon immigration as an issue. This nationalist or nativist view, which, as you note, is not unique to the United States. You find it in many different forms manifesting in Europe and elsewhere. But is it mistaken to describe this as white nationalism?
Yes and no. Well, we are seeing a rise of non-white folks supporting nationalism, often supporting what white nationalists would want. So in the Western world, I'm just reading a fascinating book comparing the United States, Germany, Belgium, France, and they're finding that the real cleavage is they use religion as opposed to race. And so even if they're not Christian, they're saying what it means to be a German, what it means to be a French person, which is amazing given what religion does or doesn't mean there. They're saying we're identified by being Christian and not some other religion. So, yes and no.
And Michael, as we look at the churches involved in this, are these the organized mainstream denominations that have traditionally, by numbers, dominated American, both Catholic and Protestant life? Or are they smaller churches, local churches? And is there an urban and rural divide in terms of the manifestation of this phenomenon?
Yeah, definitely. There's to pick up on your second part of the question. There's definitely an urban-rural divide. You find supporters of Donald Trump and of Christian nationalism writ large much more strongly in rural areas. You still find the majority in many suburban areas, but not in urban areas. Those are religious or not, very, very strongly Democratic in the way that they vote and the way that they say that their political alignment is. So on that, yes. Now, on terms of most what we'd call mainline denominations and official Catholic positions would not be supporters of this rising nationalism. So yes, it would be many of the smaller ones or non-denominational, which have come to represent maybe 30% of all Protestants now. But you also would find Southern Baptists, a very, very large traditional denomination, would have a high percentage of Christian nationalists in it. So it varies a little bit.
Let's talk about how the president is delivering these issues, immigration being a significant one, but not the only one. How's the president delivering for his Christian supporters? How much of his immigration policy, for example, does reflect the priorities of his Christian base?
Yeah, just anecdotally, when I talk to Christians, particularly conservative Christians, they are, for lack of a better term, over the moon in the way that they're seeing what they care about being actually put into policy by Donald Trump and the Congress. But let's get a little bit more specific. Interestingly, for conservative Christians in the US, they are much more likely than other Americans to say they don't want laws to protect immigrants, that they want to reduce the number of immigrants, that they definitely don't want illegal immigration in the US, that they themselves feel like they are the most discriminated group and need protection. And so basically, any way we ask about immigration, they end up being very, very conservative. So let's just look at the latest law that President Trump signed, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. just on immigration. $46.5 billion for a border wall construction. This is very pleasing to many conservative Christians because it's going to, in their minds, prevent illegal immigration. $45 million for detention facilities. Again, this will be a way to rid the country of people that should not be here in their minds. Nearly $30 million for immigration and customs enforcement. So these are huge, huge amounts of money. We also see making it harder for immigrants. So applying for work permits, you used to have to pay $50. Now you're going to have to pay $550. And there's many more issues in there. There's a canceling of Medicaid eligibility for refugees, for asylees, for humanitarian parolees. Same thing for the Affordable Care Act, having access to that. If you are in those categories, you are going to have very limited or no access to health care. And the same for SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So in so many ways, that view of wanting to reduce immigration, especially define who is an American and who is not, who is deserving as an American and who is not, we're finding it over and over again being realized in policy.
And Michael, that act, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, also significantly reduces, it ends, funding to Planned Parenthood. This is clearly a big win for this community of Christian supporters, isn't it?
It's a huge win. It's something that has been advocated for by Christian organizations, conservative Christian organizations, for decades. And when you think about it, Planned Parenthood receives about $700 million a year from the federal government to help finance these funds, usually through Medicaid. And that's just stopped. That's now in this new bill, no longer are they eligible for those.
But the bill does more than just address Planned Parenthood and the broader immigration questions. Changes to the education landscape. Now, we've seen many states, including Texas, just adopt voucher programs that would allow parents to pay for religious school tuition with public funds. Now, is this of universal appeal to this Christian supportive community, or are there divisions on this?
Among conservative Christians, there's almost universal appeal, very, very strong appeal, because so many conservative Christians either do homeschooling or send to religious schools or private schools in general. And in this new bill, as you noted, you can now donate, and this money can be, one, tax exempt, and two, used for school vouchers to help students be able to go to these private religious schools. So that's a huge win. Now, if you're not a conservative Christian, it's disturbing, to say the least.
Michael, I want to drill down on something you said. Is there any good statistical assessment of what percentage of this collective group does homeschool, does send their children to religious schools?
Yeah. In fact, one of my colleagues at the Notre Dame is David Sickink. Is this one of his specialties? So it's not the majority, but compared to other groups in the U.S., it's very high. Somewhere around a third will be sending their children to such places, whereas the general public, it would be less than 10%. Homeschooling, combining homeschooling and religious schooling, is somewhere around a third total.
Okay, how about addressing the critique, the attacks, if you want to use that term, on universities? There are a huge number of religious higher education institutions in the United States. What is the broad view amongst that community of the positions being taken towards, most prominently, Columbia, Harvard, University of Virginia, now George Mason University, targeted ouster of administrators and demands for payment from the universities?
It's been interesting reading, so as you mentioned, there are literally hundreds of religious universities and colleges in the U.S., and they tend not to be the elites, but they can be very good schools. They rely more on student tuition than having huge endowments. So they're not part of the targeted group that's been facing federal lawsuits and judgment and withholding of funds and research and such. It's interesting to hear what their leaders of these religious universities, what they have to say. They're cautious in saying they're thankful that President Trump and others are enforcing rules and wanting the best for these universities and fairness. But they're worried too that it could hurt them in some way or another. And in the new bill, it does, the new law signed. They kind of got caught in the crosshairs here. So I think probably by focusing on trying to undo the elitism that can come out of Ivy League schools, etc., a bunch of things were put into that law that will actually hurt religious schools too. And I'll just briefly mention it. We're going to have about $350 billion cut from federal student loans available. Well, that's going to hurt every student, every college, whether they're religious or not. And I think it's particularly going to hurt religious schools because they tend not to be as wealthy as some of these elites that we're talking about. Also, I don't know how they're going to do this, but if a student graduates and doesn't then pay back on their loan, they default. It's been the government that's absorbed that. Now, according to this new law, it's going to be the universities and colleges that are going to have to absorb it. So that's going to really place a burden on them. And many leaders, presidents of these religious schools have talked about this. This is really going to be difficult for them. And then finally, and this one's really important, if you graduate now from a college, they're going to hold your graduates to a standard. They are going to have to make more on average than the median salary of high school graduates in your state. If they don't, that college has to pay a fine, has to pay a fee. And the thing is, for religious schools in particular, so many of their students, percentage-wise compared to other universities, are there for religious and social service, things that don't pay a huge amount, but they're there to train for those kind of helping fields. So I have heard from several presidents of these universities, they're fearful that their students or they themselves are going to have to influence students to major in things that are not in the helping professions.
Now, Michael, there have been many changes that have come from the administration. And one of the most dramatic decisions was essentially the authorization for endorsement of political candidates from the pulpit, a radical shift from the past 70 or 80 years of history in which such endorsement has been prohibited as a condition of retaining nonprofit charitable institution status. Was this broadly supported by the community we're discussing?
It's interesting because I think that this actually took the community we're discussing by surprise. I don't think this was something they even saw coming. I'd never heard anyone really talking about this. So there were creative ways in which churches would get around this, right? Like they would say, party platforms, which ones support us, which ones don't, never mention a candidate's name, hand out guides, just pictures of candidates and say which ones support the views we say we care about, but then not from the pulpit say it. But yeah, I think this caught them by surprise, but probably good surprise because now they can actually stand at the front and say, we should as a community vote for X. And I want to just mention the implications of this at this time. You know, we began by talking about this move of Christians, practicing Christians in particular, more and more increasingly voting Republican. And now we're saying in the churches, in those churches, you can actually endorse a candidate. Well, they're overwhelmingly going to endorse whatever Republican candidate is running. So it's quite a sea change, as you mentioned.
Now, Michael, let's turn a bit 180 degrees. Where are the Trump administration's policies divisive and contrary to the views of this community? Is there pushback? Is the broad support he has enjoyed potentially jeopardized by developments, including on the economic side, over the years ahead? What do you think?
Yeah, there's controversy on a few things. So initially, there was a portion in the bill that said they would not fund gender transition surgeries and other such health issues, but that was taken out. So that was a deep disappointment for many who were advocating within religious communities, conservative religious communities. If you're not in the conservative religious camp, particularly among Christians, there's an immense amount to be disappointed by. What's happened is that this bill has dramatically furthered what we could say is a Christian nationalist agenda. So if you're not in support of that, this is a disturbing trend. It's something that can be seen as offensive. Who is America anymore? It seems more and more it's getting defined as you are a working, practicing Christian who doesn't want to see immigration and such. So,
and what you just said, and go to a very reductionist extreme. Is it in fact, or is it wrong to say that for the majority of those who would identify themselves in this broad evangelical Christian base, whatever their racial identity may be, do they adhere to a view that America was and is a Christian nation, as opposed to either a secular or a nation of many religions and no religion?
Overwhelmingly so. So we have actually done surveys on that, asking exactly that question. Conservative Christians, no matter the racial background, overwhelmingly believe that the country was a Christian nation, with the exception of African Americans. Overwhelmingly believe that the U.S. is chosen by God to be a special leader in the world and is blessed by God. Therefore, it needs to remain and become ever more so a Christian nation.
So, Michael, what we've been discussing here, what you've been assessing, looks very much like a separation of theology, of doctrine, of dogma, whatever you want to refer to it as, from a transactional execution of public policy decisions. Is that going too far?
That is not going too far. That's been one of the major sea changes that we have seen in the last couple of decades, right? This movement, this separation of a personal theology from a public theology.
And a public theology which has to do with extraordinarily secular outcome. I do differentiate here the abortion issue and the gender issues, where one can make a theological argument in support of the case. But on immigration policy, indeed, it would be difficult to extract from any major Christian or other theology the positions being taken on immigration.
Absolutely. And that's what's so stunning, that Christians should be more supportive of reducing immigration, having more restrictive policies on immigrants. That it would be hard to justify that biblically. And this then is this idea of merging a nationalist with a loosely public Christianity and somehow making them as if they are themselves together what Christianity is. The same thing we can do with class, like this idea that the only worthy people are those who work and make a living themselves. So if you have to receive aid in any way, you are morally deficient. Again, that would be hard to justify biblically.
One more question. Let's get to the personality of the president. Of all presidents in American history, the current president, his language, his rhetoric, his personal conduct really do set him aside from any predecessor in the office, including from what we would interpret as classic mainstream views of the type of behaviors, the type of rhetoric from, quote, Christian or other religious believers. How does the community juxtapose this with the extraordinary support they're expressing?
So when Trump first ran in 2016, he did not get immediate support. There were other people who were evangelical, conservative Christians who were getting his support. But as you noted, his support is not only now coalesced or conservative Christians, it's more than any other previous candidate has ever had. Well over 80% now. Why? I think I want to go back to this idea of there's Christianity and then there's Christian nationalism. The idea of what is this country supposed to be? Who's it supposed to be for? And so the language and the discussions that you hear online and in churches has gone from what is the character of the person to what is the person doing for our community, regardless of what they might do, what he might do in his individual life. So that's how it gets justified.
It's an extraordinary shift in the focus of, and it would apply to any religion, where it is not your conduct in your life and in the world that matters. It is what you do to advance specific, really public policy goals, which have a color of religious identification to them.
Correct. Exactly. And as we've mentioned, that's happening in the US and in many other countries around the world.
It's a global phenomenon. I've got to underscore the point you have been making throughout this discussion. We see manifestation of exactly these same directions, currents, views in Europe, in Russia, in India, with Modi's policies.
Yeah, it's global. And as you know, we want to study that at the Baker Institute because it is a fundamental shaping of our world right now.
Exactly. More to come. Thank you very much, Michael. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges and issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zemo. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.